It's very easy for me to see a lot of these countries facing famine in the not too distant future, because if you break down globalization, yes, that means it's difficult to get oil or manufactured goods. I'm more concerned about agriculture. Agriculture is by far the most delicate and vulnerable of the economic sectors because it needs the equipment, it needs the finance, it needs the fertilizers, it needs the trade options. You break any of those, the whole system falls apart. And with the Ukraine war, we are seeing massive disruptions to the fertilizer sector. With some of the decisions the Chinese have made, same thing. So we're already looking this year at losing roughly a third of global fertilizer supply. That is going to haunt us for a decade. Sure, it's a wide array of factors. So when you move into a city, you have less room, and that just changes the mechanics of raising kids. When you move off the farm, kids are no longer free labor. You have fewer of them. When you urbanize, when you have electricity, you've generated time. And so people can do things after sunset. This is important for everything in terms of economic development, but it's most important for women. Because if a woman moves off the farm and into the city and all of a sudden can do something after hours, you have the opportunity for mass education and freeing them from doing more than just being mothers. Nothing wrong with being a mother, but it's a full-time job on the farm. In the city, you're going to have fewer kids, that's less time allotted, and you have a greater chance to, read. And so the entire women's right movement is basically linked indelibly to electricity. And once you have it, women have fewer kids because they now have other things going on in their lives that compete for attention. With the cotton mills was probably the best example. The first group of people to urbanize weren't the men, it was the women. And we saw the impact on birth rates. It's getting difficult to get good information out of China. It's really devolved into a cult of personality state, even stricter than what Mao Zedong had. I don't think that the Chinese have a food crisis that is impacting their ability to have calories at the moment. Chinese land is among the worst in the world, and so it requires a huge amount of fertilizer to grow anything, specifically phosphate for rice. It's by far the world's most phosphate-hungry crop, and the Chinese traditionally, because of that, have been the world's largest producer and exporter of the stuff. The problem is actually with African swine fever. Now, you may have heard of that a few years ago. They had a big outbreak. They ended up culling more hogs from their farms than the rest of the world's commercial farms have hogs. Just give you an idea of just how lopsided the pork market is. It's 2/3 of it is China. They went to rebuild their herds, but they never abrogated the debts for the farmers who went out of business. They just offered subsidies to bring in new people. They thought that would be cheaper. Well, you have now 2 million new hog farmers in China who have no idea what they're doing. And let's just say that phytosanitary does not translate into Mandarin well in the first place. So we're probably in the early stages of a second wave of ASF that'll probably be just as bad, if not worse, than the first one. So pork, just like it did 2-3 years ago, is about to fall off the market in China completely. That just leaves rice. So the Chinese have banned the export of phosphate fertilizer. In the short term, this is causing massive problems in agricultural producers in East and South Asia. Australia, especially Western Australia, is probably the part that's gotten hit hardest. Brazil is feeling the impacts. Western Australia and Brazil basically can't grow without fertilizer. They don't have soil in the way that we think of the term. It's a weird geology. But you interrupt the input flows, and it's very difficult to grow food at volume. And China, in the best of times, is on a razor's edge in terms of food sustainability, and they use about 3 to 6 times as much fertilizer as is used in the global average, just because their land is so poor. Luckily, phosphate, they've got covered. They produce that themselves, but the nitrogen is all made with imported natural gas, and the phosphate, the potash, half of that comes from a different continent. So, yeah, China, demographic collapse, unavoidable. Food collapse, highly likely. And that's before you start talking about things like energy manufacturing and trade. The question is, what would you do if you're China? Where would you go to get what you want? If you go into Kazakhstan, fine, but what does the winner get? You can't go to India. Himalayas are in the way. You could go into Vietnam, but when the Chinese did that last in 1979, they got treated just as well as the Americans were. And so that was a quick war. They don't have the Navy to push out, Really not. They have made significant strides over the last 30 years. I don't mean to belittle that. But everything they're doing in the South China Sea was designed to intimidate Vietnam and the Philippines into cowering, and it had the opposite effect. And both countries just ran to Japan and now have defense pacts. It doesn't really allow the Chinese to project power very far either. They do have a lot of ships. They've got like a 650 ship navy, but 90% of them are really small and can't sail more than 1,500 kilometers from the coast. And that assumes they're going slow in a straight line and no one's shooting at them. In actual combat conditions, they can maybe make it 600K. So they don't have the power projection. And they're the country in the world that is most dependent on reaching the world in order to reach markets and resources. If the Chinese can't reach Europe, they lose their largest market. If the United States throws a trade war, they lose their second largest market. If they can't reach Africa, they lose raw material resources. If they can't reach the Persian Gulf, the lights go out. They're completely dependent on globalization as maintained by the Americans for the entirety of their economic and cultural system. The United States is the country that guarantees freedom of the seas, or traditionally that has been our role since World War II. That's what we're getting out of. And there's going to be this little fun thing with the Ukraine war that's about to happen. So I don't know how much you've been following that, but the Europeans have done an insurance ban, which has dissuaded most reputable carriers from taking Russian crude to China. So the Chinese and the Russians rented a bunch of super tankers, lashed them together into a raft off the coast of Portugal, and they're bringing shuttle tankers from Russia's ports, which can't take super tankers, and doing sea-to-sea transfers in the middle of the Atlantic. I can't wait for somebody just to do and just grab it. It could be Portugal. The Chinese don't have the naval capacity to put anything that far out, neither do the Russians. But someone soon is going to do that, and that's going to shut down the entire energy trade out of Russia. I'm a little surprised it hasn't happened already, but it's going to be a fun day when it does go down. You probably wouldn't do it just because you wanted the oil. You would do it because you want to disrupt the Russian financial system, because this would destroy it. One super tanker, the insurance policy on one super tanker is going to run about $1 billion. The Russians only have $5 billion put aside for this. So not only would you disrupt the immediate transfer, which probably would affect, I'm just spitballing here because the Russians aren't talking, but let's call it 2 to 3 million barrels immediately. But anything else that was in the chain going back to the Russian ports, probably another 10 or 15 million. I'm sorry, I said billion earlier. 2 to 3 million barrels. There's probably another 10 to 15 million barrels on shuttle tankers on their way there now. And then all of a sudden the ports get clogged, and then the pipes get clogged, and the pressure builds up into Siberia, into the permafrost, and the wells freeze. And that's it for Russian energy for 30 years. Well, part of globalization was making sure that everybody's commerce could go anywhere. In the pre-World War II environment, unless you were an empire with a navy, you didn't trade. You couldn't, because the empires were in charge. When the empires died in World War II and the Americans took over the global structures, we decided that rather than having a single American-led structure that was designed to siphon off energy and food and resources and money to the United States as an empire would, we would instead prioritize security versus the Soviets. And so we provided the economic backdrop, the security backdrop that was necessary for everyone to play. And that's the world we know. That's what we've been living in. The Americans make sure that piracy is under control. They make sure that hostile countries can't wage commerce, and they generally provide policing actions. Not to say that we've done it great in any given day, but that's been the plan, and it's broadly worked. Since 1992, we've been backing away from that. We've been closing down our overseas bases. We've been retooling our military, so it's not destroyer heavy and designed to patrol. It's carrier heavy and designed to hammer things.